He bid 4 cents for a 68-year-old widow, refused 29 times in Wyoming. I had 4 cents in my coat pocket the morning of the auction. Not $4. 4 pennies, green around the edges, the kind you find in the lining when the stitching goes. I know the exact number because I'd counted them twice on the ride in, the way a man counts what little he has left when most everything else is already gone. That was the fall of 1887. I was 63 years old, which felt about 110. The ranch had gone in July, not taken, given up, which is worse. You can be angry at a man who takes something. When you're the one who signs the paper, you've got nobody to be angry at but yourself, and I'd been doing that since midsummer with considerable dedication. My wife Adeline had died in March. Fever. 4 days from fine to gone, and I wasn't even there for the last 2 of them. I was in Laramie trying to sell 3 horses I needed to sell to cover a note I couldn't cover. I got back, and she was already wrapped in the sheet her mother had sent from Ohio. That sheet had little blue flowers on the hem. I remember standing in the doorway looking at those flowers and thinking nothing, not grief yet. Just nothing, the way a man goes hollow before the pain finds him. The note came due in June. I didn't fight it, I didn't see the point. By September, I was sleeping in the livery in Garnet Creek, doing odd work for Hal Purcell, who owned it, and not eating enough to keep a dog alive. Not because there wasn't food, because I kept forgetting to want it. The auction was for the Beaumont place, east of town, about 6 miles. Old Warren Beaumont had died in August, stroke, out in his south field, his hat still on, and his daughter Clara was selling the property. She wasn't from Wyoming anymore. She'd gone to St. Louis years back and married a man with a collar that buttoned to his chin, and she wanted the money, not the land. I rode out there with no intention of buying anything. I went because Hal told me to go, said he needed a fair accounting of the livestock prices so he'd know what his own stock was worth. I was doing Hal favors instead of wages because I hadn't asked for wages and he hadn't offered, and that arrangement suited the mood I was in. So I was standing at the back of the crowd, 40, maybe 50 men around the barn, and I was watching the auctioneer work through the Beaumont equipment. A good McCormick reaper, a hay rake with a bent tooth, 3 wagons, a pair of mules that stood like they were made of iron. And then came Nora Calhoun. I didn't know her name yet, I learned it later. She was standing off to the side of the barn in a gray wool coat, a hat with a single dark feather, and the kind of stillness that comes from having already made your peace with however the day goes. 68 years old, Clara Beaumont had told the auctioneer, because Clara had apparently felt this was important information. A widow. Owned 30 acres adjoining the Beaumont east fence. Good well on it, decent house. But the taxes had come due, and she'd defaulted, and so her land was being sold along with everything else Warren Beaumont had left behind. She stood there while they described her property the way you'd describe a piece of furniture. 30 acres, water rights, existing structure in fair condition. Her face gave nothing. The bidding opened at $40. 29 men bid. I counted later in my head the way I kept counting things. 29 bids over about 4 minutes, and then one by one they dropped out, too high, not interested, waiting for the next lot. The price went up to $280, and then it stopped. The last bidder was a man named Dolph Shear, who was land-hungry and had the money and bid the way a man bids when he's buying a hammer. He stopped bidding at $280. I didn't know why. I found out later that his wife had said something to him when the auctioneer described the situation, the age, the widow, and that Dolph Shear, whatever else he was, listened to his wife. He just went quiet and looked at his boots and didn't raise his hand again. The auctioneer looked around. $280. Do I have $285? Nothing. $280 going once. Nora Calhoun looked at the ground, not ashamed, past it. There's a look a person gets when they've already finished being embarrassed and arrived somewhere quieter and colder on the other side of it. That was the look she had. $280 going twice. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm not sure I was thinking. My hand went up. 4 cents, I said. The crowd went quiet the way crowds go quiet when something happens that doesn't fit any category they have for things. The auctioneer looked at me. Sir, he said. 4 cents, I said again. It's what I have. A few men laughed, not mean, startled. The auctioneer looked at Clara Beaumont's man from St. Louis who was standing near the barn door with a ledger. The man from St. Louis looked at the auctioneer. The auctioneer looked back at me. I had taken the 4 pennies out of my pocket, and I was holding them in my open hand so they could be seen. Nora Calhoun raised her eyes and looked at me directly. That was the moment I'm talking about, if I had to say there was one moment. Not later, right then. Because the way she looked at me, not grateful, not confused, she looked at me like she was trying to understand what kind of man does a thing like that, and she hadn't decided yet, but she was going to find out. I hadn't been looked at that way in a long time, maybe ever. The auctioneer said, 4 cents going once. He wasn't trying to be funny. He'd done auctions for 30 years in this territory, and I think he understood, in that way people who have seen enough of life understand things, what was happening and what it was worth. 4 cents going twice. He brought the gavel down. Sold. I walked to the table and put the 4 pennies down. The man from St. Louis stared at them. He started to say something and then didn't. I think Clara Beaumont had instructed him to sell the property, and the property had been sold, and the law doesn't say what the selling price has to be, and he was trying to find the angle where this became a problem for him and not finding it. I signed the deed transfer. My hand was steadier than it had any right to be. I turned, and Nora Calhoun was standing 3 feet behind me. I hadn't heard her cross the ground. She said, "I don't need a keeper." "No, ma'am," I said. "I could see that." She looked at me another moment. Then she said, "My name is Nora Calhoun. I'll need to see that deed when the ink dries, and I'll need your name on a separate paper giving the property back to me, and I'll need you to agree that you're owed nothing for this except whatever you decide is right." I said, "My name is Eustace Vane, and I'll draw up whatever paper you need, and I don't want anything." She studied me. Why? I thought about it. I'm not a man who talks fast or explains himself easily, and I wasn't going to start lying at 63. "Because you were standing there like the last woman left standing," I said. "And I had 4 cents. She didn't say anything to that. She just nodded once, the way a person nods when they've been given an answer that's true and they know it's true and they're putting it away somewhere to think about later. I drew up the paper that afternoon in Garnet Creek, at Pemberton's Dry Goods, which had the only desk in town I could use without paying for it. I rode the deed out to her place the next morning. She met me at the porch. The house was small and kept. A woodpile stacked tight along the south wall. A kitchen garden that had been turned under for winter, but you could see where it had been, the rows still visible in the dark soil. She read the deed and then the transfer paper, and then she looked up. "You wrote it right," she said. "I've written some contracts," I said. "I used to have a ranch." "What happened to it?" "My wife died," I said. "Then I let the rest go." She was quiet, then she said, "Come inside, there's coffee." I said I didn't want to put her out. She said, "I've been alone out here for 4 years and I would like to put someone out. Come inside." I didn't leave until the following Tuesday. Not like that, or not only like that. What happened was, I came inside and drank the coffee, and she asked me about the ranch, and I told her more than I'd told anyone, including things I hadn't entirely said out loud to myself yet. And she listened the way some people listen, not waiting for you to finish so they can talk, but actually taking in what you're saying and turning it over. When I got to the part about Adeline and the sheet with the blue flowers, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My husband died in '83. His name was Robert. He was a good man who didn't talk enough and laughed at the wrong times, and I would give considerable to hear him laugh at the wrong time again." I understood that completely. She fed me supper because it was late by then, and it was cold riding, and she had a spare room from when her son used to visit, and I slept in it, and it smelled like cedar and old wool, and I slept 9 hours, which was 8 more than I'd managed most nights since March. The next morning she had a fence post that needed setting on the south line, and I set it, because I could see her looking at it, and I know when a man is needed. And then she had a water pump with a leather seal gone bad, and I had the seal fixed by noon. And she made dinner and I ate it, and in the afternoon I split a cord of wood that was sitting in rounds by the barn. She came out at the end of the afternoon and stood watching me for a minute. "You don't have anywhere to be," she said. "No," I said. "There's work here," she said. "That would be worth a wage if you wanted." "I'd want," I said. She nodded and went back inside. That was the whole conversation. That was all it needed to be. There's nothing simple about getting to know someone at 63. You've both got history the length of a territory and habits carved in like water-cut stone. And you're not young enough to pretend the past didn't happen or that you're something other than what you are. What I am is a man who goes quiet when he doesn't know what to say, which is often. A man who doesn't touch things that aren't his. A man who works because the work keeps the mind from eating itself, and who had been very close to letting his mind do exactly that for most of the year. Nora was a woman who said what she meant without embellishment, who had opinions about everything from county politics to the correct way to pack a root cellar and was right about most of it, who had been by herself long enough that she'd stopped apologizing for who she was, and who laughed, not often, but when she did it was the kind of laugh that changes the temperature of a room. We didn't get from the fence post to anything else for about 4 months. It was winter by then, real Wyoming winter, the kind that makes you understand why people went back east. I was sleeping in the spare room and doing the work and taking the wage, and we had supper together every night and talked, and that was good. That was more than good. That was the most alive I'd felt since March, and I knew it, and I think she knew it too. One evening in January, she said, without looking up from her sewing, "You grieve quietly." I said, "I suppose." She said, "So do I think that's the kind we are." I sat with that. The fire was going. Outside, the wind was working on the eaves the way it does in January when it means business. I said, "Nora." She looked up. I said, I don't know what I'm doing here if I'm honest. I don't know what to call it." She put the sewing down. "You don't have to call it anything," she said. "Not yet." She had this way of looking at a person. I'd noticed it at the auction, and I'd seen it dozens of times since, at supper, over the fence line, across the room like now, where she looked at you like she had the patience to wait until you got to the truth of what you were trying to say, and she was going to wait there as long as it took. Nobody had ever done that with me. Not even Adeline, God rest her, who was a fine woman but who had her own pace and her own current, and you got on or got out of the way. Nora Calhoun just waited and watched, and let you be a man sorting himself out. "I lost a year," I said. "Maybe more since she died, maybe before." She nodded. "I know," she said. "I watched you come back into it, a little at a time. Like a field in March." I didn't know what to say to that. She came and sat down on the settee beside me, not pressed up against me, but close enough that I could have reached out, and there was no reason not to, and she said, "Eustace, you came out to that auction with 4 cents and you stood up in front of 50 men and bid 4 cents, and that took something. You know what it took." I said I didn't. "It took a man who still had something in him," she said. "A man who was finished with things doesn't do that. A man who's finished stays at the back and watches and goes home." I said I didn't have a home to go to. "I know that too," she said. "And you went anyway, that's what I'm saying." She reached over and took my hand. Just took it, held it, her hands smaller than mine and rougher than you'd expect. The hands of a woman who'd worked 30 acres alone for 4 years. We sat there a good while without talking. There wasn't anything that needed saying. We married in April in Garnet Creek in front of Pastor Dewey and Hal Purcell and 6 others. Nora wore a blue dress the color of the sky that day, which was the particular blue Wyoming gets in early spring, clean and cold and going all the way up. I wore my good coat, which Nora had mended at the collar the week before. Dolph Shear came to the wedding. His wife made him come. He stood in the back, and afterward he came and shook my hand and said, "Good thing you had that 4 cents." I told him it was. His wife hugged Nora and cried a little. We went back to the property that evening. 30 acres. Good well. House that needed work on the south porch, which I started on the following Monday. 12 years ago now. I'm 75 and she's 80, and Wyoming winters take a little more out of a person than they used to, but the fire draws good and the wood is stacked, and the well never went dry in all the years we've been here. There's a thing she does in the morning, early before I'm fully awake. She'll come back to bed after she's lit the stove and she'll settle in against my side, not to sleep again, just to be there, and she'll put her hand on my chest, just flat, like she's steadying something, and stay that way until the room warms up. I never told her I'm awake when she does it. Some things you keep. I'll tell you what I know for certain. I rode into that auction with nothing, no property, no prospects, no clear reason to go on being what I was. And I rode home with a deed in my pocket that I handed back the next morning, which meant I came home with 4 fewer cents than I started with, and nothing materially changed. But there was a woman who looked at me across a crowd, like she was deciding what kind of man does a thing like that. And she decided I was worth finding out. That's the whole of it. A man waits his whole life to be seen clear by somebody worth being seen by, and most men die still waiting, and I know that because I almost did. What she gave me, this woman, what she gave me was the thing I'd been running so low on I'd stopped noticing I needed it. The 4 cents were the least of what it cost. The rest was just the rest of my life, which turned out to be worth something after all.